Why have people looked the same for the last 20 years?
No, but this is a question people should be asking. Not just how people look. Let's expand the question a little bit. Why is it the case that in 20 years, very little has changed in the material relationships of anyone's life watching this TikTok? Why has there been a nearly non-stop recreation of nostalgic old tropes in Hollywood? Just everything is a remake of a remake of a reboot of a reboot of something that was made 40, 50 years ago. Why does music sound the same as NSYNC's Dirty Pop from the late 90s? Finally, deeper, aside from the superficial elements of storytelling and diversity in casting and things like that, why have stories effectively been exactly the same as they were 20 to 30 years ago? The narratives, the subject matters, the themes have not changed. Why could that be the case? In order to try to find an answer, let's listen to this guy, Mark Fisher. Fisher is most famous for his book, Capitalist Realism. And what capitalist realism basically means in a nutshell is that capitalism is the only thing you can imagine. You cannot imagine existing in a system outside of it. In this world today, not just in New York, but all over the world, we all basically live in that system, especially Hollywood, especially places that make art. But wait a minute, Brennan, I thought that art was basically supposed to challenge things like power structures. Yeah, maybe on the level of the superficial, but actually most art produced today, whether it's music or architecture or movies or TV shows or fashion, doesn't try to challenge any of the deeper material relations that capitalism has us trapped within. It's just trying to make money. Don't take my word for it. Mark Fisher wrote an amazing paper called The Slow Cancellation of the Future, in which he took ideas from the postmodern theorist Fredric Jameson about the cultural logic of late capitalism. What Fredric Jameson basically argues is that capital has circumscribed the entire world that we live in. Everything that we do, it used to be the case that it was centered on some other ideal. It could be God, it could be human beings, it could be loving relationships, but actually now it's capital. It's the center of our world, it's the center of art creation. I mean, think about it. How many SoundCloud rappers do you know who basically actually care about music? So I'll take it even a step further. French theorist Marc Augé calls this supermodernity, or basically non-spaces. He's famous for coining the term liminal spaces. So what Mark basically says is that whereas the world used to be human-centered, that people built spaces and built things for ourselves, it's now capital-centered, which means that a lot of the spaces that we physically live our lives in are not actually built for us. They're actually built to help us facilitate capital. Think of superhighways, airport terminals, tarmacs, things like this. People aren't meant to occupy those spaces. They're only meant to be there incidentally in order to help the communication of capital. You gotta drive to work, you gotta take a plane to another place, this kind of thing. But that's not just physical places. That's not just physical spaces. That's also art. That's also music. That's also movies. And that's also fashion. Some music has to play in the background of a Walgreens. Netflix has to give something to subscribers to watch. And you have to wear something during the day. Okay, Brendan, we're 3 minutes into this video and you still haven't answered why it hasn't changed in almost 30 years. Fashion and art haven't changed in almost 30 years because since Bill Clinton became president in the early 90s, we've basically been trapped in the same exact neoliberal late capital system the whole time. The power structures that enable that system to continue functioning and have us trapped within it effectively haven't changed. They've been in power the entire time. Same financial institutions, studios, and heads of fashion, and even musicians have basically been popular and on top of the industries they've been in since the 90s. Now here's the part where I'm going to take you out to outer space. Ready? Think about the history of fashion. You can basically tell in a movie that you're watching when something is placed by what someone is wearing. You can tell maybe the century that someone is in, but you can't exactly tell the decade. And it gets harder the further you go back. If you go back to the Roman Empire, is it early or late Roman Empire? They basically wore very similar things during that period of time. I'm not a historian of fashion. I'm open to being wrong about this, but I think I'm right. Now think about the 1950s through the 1990s. That's a 4-decade period of time. A lot in fashion changed during that period of time. A lot in music, a lot in movies, a lot in all kinds of art. Even architecture changed since the 1950s to the 1990s. Really, that period of time, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, lots of transformational time during that period. It was also a tumultuous period of time, the 20th century, for the entire world and for us culturally. So of course it changed a lot. Of course art changed a lot. But why was it changing? It was changing because the power relationships between capital and the rest of culture was re-solidifying. And what basically happened was that capital won and it became the center, the focus. And again, I could be wrong, but the history of macroeconomics during this period of time is basically a series of different consolidations of businesses into larger and larger financial institutions. So what we really should be asking is not why things haven't changed over the last 20 to 30 years, but why did they change so much in the time before that, in the 20th century? The reason that fashion and art did not change so much historically, more on the era of centuries or of even hundreds of years than they did in the last 100 years in the 20th century, where they changed decade by decade, is because the power relationships between society, between culture, and the people at the head didn't change either. European monarchies lasted hundreds of years. The Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years. So things haven't changed, just like Mark Fisher said in The Slow Cancellation of the Future, because the power relationships haven't changed in 20 to 30 years. And they're not going to change in the future, because the power relationships that have been established now intend to be, like the Roman Empire, here for another 1,000 years. Unless we do something to change it.